Essential question. How are characteristics inherited? Georgia Fast Fact. The code of life. These strands of DNA look oddly twisted, but they contain all the information that cells need to carry out life processes and pass on traits. In the Investigate, you'll learn about some inherited traits. Vocabulary preview. Inherited trait, a characteristic passed from parents to their offspring, page 328. Dominant trait, a trait that appears even if an organism has only one factor for the trait, page 330. Recessive trait, a trait that appears only if an organism has two factors for the trait, page 330. Gene, the part of a chromosome that contains the DNA code for an inherited trait, page 332. How characteristics are inherited. You may have a friend who looks a lot like her parents. She may share her mother's eye color and dimples, or have the same type of hair or skin color as her father. These and many other traits are inherited. An inherited trait is a characteristic passed from parents to their offspring. In humans, hair color, eye color, and skin color are inherited. Freckles, hair texture, and earlobe shape are inherited too. So are some behaviors. For example, the tendency to be right-handed or left-handed is inherited. In animals, eye color is inherited. So are fur color and texture. Each of the puppies in the picture on this page inherited some traits from its parents, including facial shape and hair texture. All the puppies have faces that are the same shape, and all have similar hair texture. The puppies are not identical, though. One puppy doesn't look much like its parents, but its fur color was inherited. For thousands of years, farmers have selected animals through breeding. They've bred animals having some desirable traits with animals having other desirable traits, so that the offspring would have these traits too. Farmers knew that traits were passed from parents to their offspring, but they didn't know how. The way traits are passed from parents to offspring interested Gregor Mendel, a 19th century Austrian monk. Mendel's work in a monastery garden made him want to understand the inheritance of traits. He noticed that some pea plants were tall and others were short. He thought that these traits were inherited, but he didn't know how. In 1857, he began experimenting. First, he bred tall pea plants with short pea plants. All the offspring, the first generation, were tall. When these tall plants were allowed to breed, 3/4 of the offspring, the second generation, were tall, but 1/4 were short. These results led Mendel to hypothesize that a characteristic is controlled by a pair of factors. Each parent passes one of its pair of factors to an offspring. The way the factors combine in the offspring controls which trait appears in each individual. Mendel learned that traits can skip a generation. As shown above, when he bred tall plants with short plants, the offspring were all tall. But short plants appeared again in the second generation. Inheritance in all organisms, including people, works this way. You can inherit a trait, blue eyes, for example, that neither of your parents shows, as long as people before them in your family had that trait. Focus skill, cause and effect. Why are some pea plants short while others are tall? Most of the puppies in this litter look like the parents, but even the one that looks different inherited many of its parents' traits. Gregor Mendel's early experiments with pea plants taught scientists how traits are passed from parents to their offspring. Math in science. Interpret data. Results of some of Mendel's experiments with pea plants might have included the following. First-generation offspring. 2 tall parents crossbred resulted in 100% tall offspring. Second-generation offspring. 2 first-generation offspring crossbred, resulting in 75% tall offspring, 25% short offspring. If there were 200 second-generation offspring, how many of them were short? Thanks to the work of Gregor Mendel, we know that this child inherited her deep blue eyes from her parents, even though they both have brown eyes. Dominant and recessive traits. Mendel did hundreds of experiments and kept careful records of his results. Again and again, he found that first-generation offspring of tall plants and short plants were tall, but second-generation offspring included about 1/4 short plants. He hypothesized that the first-generation plants must have a hidden factor for shortness. How else could this trait appear in the second generation? In pea plants, tallness is a strong trait, or a dominant trait. If an organism has one factor for a dominant trait, that trait appears. Shortness in pea plants is a weak trait, or a recessive trait. A recessive trait appears only if an organism has 2 factors for the trait. If both a dominant factor and a recessive factor are present, the dominant trait appears. This explains why 3/4 of Mendel's second-generation pea plants were tall. Plants with 1 or 2 factors for tallness were tall. Only plants with 2 factors for shortness were short. Look at the example about fur color in mice. 3 of the offspring are dark brown, and 1 is light brown. Both parents have dark brown fur, which is dominant. For light brown fur to appear, both parents must have a factor for light brown fur. In humans, having blue eyes is a recessive trait. Can 2 brown-eyed parents have a child with blue eyes? Yes, but they must both have a hidden factor for blue eyes. In the Investigate at the beginning of this lesson, you observed several inherited traits. The ability to roll your tongue is a dominant trait. If you can roll your tongue, you inherited either 2 dominant factors, 1 from each parent, or 1 dominant factor and 1 recessive factor. If you aren't able to roll your tongue, you inherited 2 recessive factors, 1 from each parent. Unattached earlobes are dominant, and attached earlobes are recessive. If your earlobes are unattached, you inherited at least 1 dominant factor. If you have attached earlobes, you inherited 2 recessive factors. Even though right-handedness is dominant, most people rest the left thumb on top when they fold their hands. Resting the left thumb on top is dominant. If you rest your right thumb on top, what factors did you inherit? Focus skill. Cause and effect. What are the possible results of breeding a dark brown mouse with a light brown mouse? You can use a Punnett square to predict the traits that offspring will show. In mice, dark brown fur is dominant. Dominant factors in the square are capital letters. Here, capital B is the factor for dark brown fur, and lowercase b is the factor for light brown fur. One parent's factors are shown at the top of the square, and the other parent's factors are shown at the left of the square. You can predict the fur color of the offspring by pairing each factor from one parent with each factor from the other parent. Most dogs have fur, but this dog has hardly any. It inherited a recessive factor for hairlessness from each of its parents. Instalab. Heads or tails? Toss a pair of coins 32 times and record how they land. Suppose heads represents a dominant factor and tails represents a recessive factor. Calculate the number of times a dominant trait is expected to appear. Compare this number with your coin tosses. Genes. Today, Mendel's factors are known to be different forms of genes. A gene is the part of a chromosome that contains the DNA code for an inherited trait. DNA is a chemical that provides detailed instructions to the cell about every function of life. For example, it directs the cell to divide to make more cells and to perform various other activities. A gene for a particular trait is found at a specific place on a chromosome. All inherited traits, tongue rolling, thumb position, hair color, and thousands more are controlled by genes. Like every organism, you are genetically unique. You share some characteristics with most humans, but unless you have an identical twin, there is no one else with exactly the same combination of genes that you have. This is because there are so many traits determined by genes. The chances of you and another unrelated person being an exact match are astronomical. What makes you different from everyone else? Remember that during meiosis, each gamete gets only half the chromosomes of a body cell. So each of your parents contributed half of his or her genes to you. You probably inherited many genes for dominant traits. You also inherited some genes for recessive traits. In any case, the particular combination of about 30,000 different genes you inherited is what makes you unique. You may have eyes like your mother's or hair like your father's, but there's no one else exactly like you. This is how all multicellular organisms pass on their genetic information. The chemical DNA is the same for all living things. So your genes even determine that you are human instead of a beetle or a fish. Focus skill. Cause and effect. How does meiosis affect inheritance through your genes? Scientists can now study individual genes to figure out how certain diseases are inherited. Chromosomes are found in the nucleus of animal cells. The gene for a characteristic is found at a certain location on a chromosome. Genes are composed of thousands of strands of DNA. GPS, wrap-up and lesson review. Essential question. How are characteristics inherited? In this lesson, you learned the role of chromosomes and genes in transferring traits from adults to offspring.